Reconstruction started with President Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to bring the nation back together after the Civil War as quickly as possible. He offered his plan for Reconstruction in December 1863, which required that states' new constitutions prohibit slavery. Then, on December 18, 1865, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, formally abolishing slavery. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, and less than a week afterwards, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
We also are seeing it with the Confederate statue removal in the South. There's still that legacy of the Civil War, even though it happened a long time ago.
Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, briefly continued Lincoln's policies and announced his own plans for Reconstruction in May of 1865. However, in 1877, Reconstruction and the effort to obtain equal black rights ended after the Compromise of 1877. In 1876, there was a disputed presidential election between Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes and Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden. Democratic leaders allowed Hayes to become president under a few major terms, such as restoring the Home Rule and withdrawing federal soldiers from their position in the South. The Compromise of 1877 marked a major turning point in American political history, effectively ending the Reconstruction era and ushering in the system of Jim Crow. The Great Betrayal: How the Compromise of 1877 Brought America to its Knees.
The conflict was there was a presidential election in 1876. There was a lot of voter fraud that occurred in the South, or voter intimidation. One state in particular, Florida, was contested, which was actually contested recently in 2000 as well.
President Andrew Johnson's newly introduced plans for Reconstruction in May 1865 included the abolition of slavery and a vow to loyalty to the nation that Southern states were required to take before they could be readmitted. After Andrew Johnson came Ulysses S. Grant. Grant disabled the Ku Klux Klan in the South until 1920, but racism still existed. Grant was renominated and won the election in 1872, but scandal afflicted his Secretary of War, William E. Belknap, and his private secretary, Orville E. Babcock, who were both involved in graft schemes and political corruption. He left the office in disgrace. Ulysses S. Grant wanted to run again in 1876, but scandal and the stopped him from doing so. James G. Blaine was the frontrunner of Ulysses S. Grant's Republican Party. Scandal ruined James G. Blaine as well, and because of these scandals, the Republican Party brought in Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes did not offend the radicals or reformers, giving him an added advantage. A quote by Rutherford B. Hayes states, "Universal suffrage is sound in principle. The radical element is right." The Compromise of 1877 was the 23rd United States presidential election that took place on November 7, 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor of Ohio, was a Civil War hero and was known as a reformer. William A. Wheeler, a U.S. representative from New York, was Hayes' running mate. Samuel Tilden was a Bourbon Democrat, meaning he was a classical liberal supporting free trade and the gold standard, and opposing things like imperialism. His running mate was Thomas Hendricks, the governor of Indiana. There was also a third political party called the Greenback Party in the 1876 election.
So the Greenback Party was, well, at least at this time, mainly a party representing the interests of farmers, and they advocated a specific monetary policy that would probably lead to greater inflation, so prices would rise. It would also increase the monetary supply available to farmers.
The Greenback Party nominated Peter Cooper, an inventor and entrepreneur, to run for president. Cooper was the oldest person ever nominated for president in American history. Peter Cooper's running mate was Samuel Fenton Cary, the former representative from Ohio. The Greenback Party did not have as big a chance as the Republicans and Democrats did.
So third parties typically in close elections can cause states to go one way or another. So they basically split the vote. I had mentioned the election of 2000, the Green Party, many people believe cost Al Gore a victory in Florida. And I think the Greenbacks probably did something similar in such a close election. There might have been several states that could have gone one way or the other if they had not been there.
By midnight, Samuel Tilden had 184 out of the 185 electoral votes needed and led the popular vote by 250,000. However, the Republicans called foul play on the Democrats, accusing them of using intimidation and bribery in the southern states to get African Americans not to vote. The Democrats accused the Republicans of not counting Tilden's votes. 20 of the electoral votes were disputed in 4 states: Florida, Louisiana, Oregon, and South Carolina. Congress sent an electoral commission to investigate and resolve the dispute. The commission had 5 representatives of the U.S. Congress that were Democratic, 5 that were Republican, 2 justices were Democratic, 2 justices were Republican, so the votes were tied. But first, the terms had to be worked out behind closed doors. The terms that were finally agreed to were, number 1, to withdraw federal soldiers from their remaining positions in the South, Louisiana, South Carolina, Oregon, and Florida. Number 2, to restore the Home Rule, which meant that the Republican Party would refrain from integrating in the affairs of the South and allow white Democrats, many of them racist, to rule. Number 3, to appoint Democrats to patronage positions in the South. Number 4, to appoint a Democrat to the President's cabinet. And number 5, to pass federal legislation that would encourage industrialization in the South. To United States history, the terms of the compromise would allow the disenfranchisement of black voters and the imposition of racial segregation. Also, federal funding would be made available for internal improvements in the South. The Compromise of 1877 was seen as the great betrayal by former slaves because the Republicans abandoned their efforts to obtain equal rights for black Americans. Henry Adams of Louisiana expressed the feeling of many African Americans. Quote, "The whole South, every state in the South, had got into the hands of the very men that held us as slaves." Hayes accomplished very little during his 4 years as president, and is recognized today as being weak and ineffective. He was jokingly referred to as Brother Fraud, his fraudulency, and his accidency. With the election of 1876, laws under the system of Jim Crow were imposed.
Jim Crow laws were a series of laws instituted across the South in the late 1800s, and especially, or the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that continued through the 1960s, 1970s or so. And they were laws designed to chip away at what were supposed to be the rights formally granted to African Americans after the end of the Civil War.
Jim Crow laws were laws that affected almost every aspect of black lives by mandating segregation of schools, parks, libraries, drinking fountains, restrooms, buses, trains, and restaurants. Whites only and colored signs were constant reminders of this enforced racial order.
Jim Crow laws had to do with enforcing segregation, so limiting certain public spaces only to white people, or separating white and African American people.
Overall, the Compromise of 1877 was a landmark event in American history that saved a nation whose wounds from the Civil War were still fresh, but delayed efforts for black equality until the 1950s.
I think the Compromise of 1877 changed history because it ended Reconstruction. We were on a rapid path towards equality with black Americans. We had made a lot of progress going from slavery to allowing them to vote. There were black Americans who were senators, representatives in these southern states. That's something you wouldn't see again until the 60s and 70s. So I think it put civil rights and equality back probably 100 years.
Today, America is a long ways away from being completely cured from racism. First of all, there are hate groups in every state, and hate crimes are motivated by race more than any other factor. Secondly, black men are shot and killed more often than white. An armed black man was shot and killed by police every 9 days in 2015. Lately, racism has shown itself in sports. Colin Kaepernick was the start of the movement when the world saw him take a knee during the national anthem. His action caused lots of controversy. Some people thought he was using his prominence to influence others and take action for something he believed in, while others viewed it as a sign of disrespect. According to Kaepernick, the protest was a stand against police brutality and a sign of support for people of color.
We are still dealing with how we discuss race, especially in sports. A lot of people don't think things like Colin Kaepernick and his kneeling should be done during a sporting event. It's for fun. We shouldn't bring politics into, our escape from some of these difficult issues.
The Compromise of 1877 as a whole was an election between the Republican and Democratic candidate Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. The votes on 4 states were disputed, causing conflict. A compromise was reached when the Democratic leaders let Hayes become president in exchange for a few terms, that led to the ushering in of Jim Crow laws and the end of Reconstruction.